Hello, everyone. On behalf of IBM Systems Magazine, I'd like to welcome you to today's presentation. My name is Janine Donnelly. I am the manager of webinars for IBM Systems Magazine, and I will be the moderator for today's event. We will be holding a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. You may ask a question at any time during the event by entering it into the Q&A panel. If you experience technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the Q&A panel to alert us, and someone will assist you. You may download a PDF version of the slide deck by clicking on the drop-down menu labeled Event Resources on the left side of your screen. Today's webinar, Get Your GDPR Recovery Requirements Covered with BMC's Solutions for Db2 ZOS, is sponsored by BMC Software. Our featured speakers today are Alan Warhurst and Phil Granger. Alan has been in the IT industry for over 16 years and at BMC since 2014. He is currently lead product manager in the ZSO organization, responsible for overall product strategy and innovation. Phil has almost 30 years of experience in Db2, from Db2 version 1.2 to Db2 11. Phil has been honored by IBM as an information champion from 2009 to 2016. Currently, Phil is enablement manager at BMC in support of their Db2 tools. Today, Alan and Phil will walk you through recovery solutions that will help you stay ahead of the curve and the auditors when it comes to GDPR. With our introductions complete, Alan, I'll turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you very much, Janine, and hello, everyone. So today we want to talk through GDPR and particularly how BMC Solutions can help you cope with some of the recovery requirements that are specified in it. So I want to start just a little bit by going through just a tiny bit of information about GDPR. I'm sure many of you will have heard all sorts of pieces of information, and this is certainly not a presentation on the detail around it. There are many of those out there. But just as a reminder, GDPR is a piece of legislation from the European Union that relates to the data, the personal data of EU citizens. It's an interesting piece of legislation because it's what's known as extraterritorial, so it applies to the entire world. It's specific to the data that is the personal data of EU citizens, not where that data is stored or where that data is processed. And at the moment, whilst it is law, it's not really being enforced. That enforcement will come in May next year, May the 25th. Ultimately, the idea of the legislation is to increase the privacy and the protection for individuals, their personal data, and it also gives regulatory authorities a greater amount of capability to go away and take action against people who are not looking after people's data. So why has everybody got excited about it? Well, one of the things I just said there was GDPR is about giving regulatory authorities teeth. It's, of all of the pieces of legislation around the world, it's probably the one that attracts the highest level of fine, which for serious breaches can be 4% of global revenue or 20 million euros, whichever is higher. And like I said at the beginning, this is extraterritorial. This applies to lots of different countries. It applies to all sorts of places. A recent survey showed that 94% of US CIOs believe they have some form of data that will be affected by it. And 90% of those CIOs are worried about the impact that will then have on their business and their ability to process that data and use it for what they use it now. And just to illustrate that, I mean, 20 million euros is an awful lot of money, but a recent data breach, November last year, for a UK bank, there's obviously some interpretation in this based on the fact that it's not truly come into force yet. No test cases have gone through, but there is a general belief that had that hack happened under a GDPR regime, that particular bank would have been liable for a fine of £1.9 billion. So that's more than €2 billion, more than $2 billion, which is an astounding amount of money if you think about it. And what this now means is that lots of organisations are taking it seriously. We've been speaking to our customers over the past 12 months and have noticed an increase in focus, an increase in desire to get to a state where they are going to be GDPR compliant. So again, another fairly recent survey has shown that 77% of people plan to spend more than $1 million to make sure that they are ready, that they are compliant. 9% of people actually expect to spend more than $10 million. And, you know, on average, they're going to spend somewhere in the region of $1.3 million just on training, making sure that people have capabilities and understand what they're going to do. One thing that is sure is that the larger the company, the more complex your environment, the more money you're going to spend. And the reason that an awful lot of people are talking about GDPR, an awful lot of organisations are talking about GDPR, is most people are looking for some form of external help. It's a big additional piece of work. It's a big additional burden on all IT organisations. So 65% of people are seeking some form of external help. So there's a lot of focus, there's a lot of people thinking about it, but what are the key areas that GDPR needs to consider? The first one is, and the one that's probably most important to us as BMC, is the security of data processing. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but it's the fundamental part of GDPR that you, if you're looking after someone's data, that you manage it, you control it in a good way, that you enforce certain levels of security and recoverability and those kind of things around it. GDPR is probably the first piece of legislation that embeds within it the concept of data protection by design and default. So that means that people's data, the way that systems are designed, is to include security from the start, not something that's retrofitted later. That means that fundamentally that they are secure in design rather than someone, you know, putting a sticky plaster over it later on. And again, part of this whole accountability piece is all organisations need to appoint someone called a data protection officer, who is answerable to the highest levels of the organisation. They are the throat to choke. They are the person for making sure that an organisation is compliant with GDPR. We said it before, but the EU rules apply to, although it's an EU regulation, this applies to any country, any organisation that processes data from an EU citizen. The term they use is extraterritorial, so that means it can be enforced upon anybody at any time if the data in question belongs to an EU citizen. And those citizens themselves have an increased level of rights to their data. So things like the right to be forgotten, the ability to understand what data a company holds on them, at the point of that data being given, having to make sure that you have explicit permission to use it for things, to tell someone how long you're going to hang on to that data, all those kind of pieces. And these levels of complexity all sit there. And the final one, and the one that's got a lot of people quite excited, is about the notification period. So there are a number of pieces of data breach legislation around the world, Australia, various ones in the US, and those kind of things. They have various notification periods. The one for GDPR is now 72 hours. So from the point that the organisation understands that there is a breach, they must notify their controlling authority within 72 hours, which is considerably shorter than, for example, Australia, which I think is 30 days, and some of the ones in the US, which are more like 90 days. So it's a very big piece of legislation. It's a very complicated piece of legislation. And there's a lot of organisations that are focused on trying to help you with it. So the piece that BMC particularly helps with, the bit that we're kind of interested in, the bit that Phil will talk to you more about in a moment, is about the security of the data processing and the recovery of data. If you ever want to read the full legislation, and if you suffer from insomnia, I recommend you do, then it's actually Article 32, Section 32, that talks very specifically there. And as you can see on the slide, for those things that are highlighted in orange, there is a number of things. So you're responsible for making sure that you've got the ongoing confidentiality, particularly the integrity, availability and resilience of the processing. So you must make sure that you've got good data integrity. you must be able to restore that data. So if you've got hold of somebody's data and you're managing it, you must be able to restore it and restore access to it within a reasonable time frame. And then finally, you must also check. You must test. You must regularly test that any measures that you have in place to ensure that data integrity, to ensure that recovery and those kind of things are regularly tested, and that you can prove that you can recover data, that you've got your data backed up, and those kind of pieces. So that brings us to our first poll of this afternoon, this evening. And that is about whether people are aware that actually data recovery is part of GDPR. Lots of people talk about it in many ways. So Janine, if you could open up the poll for us, please.
Great. Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, we have launched that poll. We're looking for your feedback on this question. Are you aware of GDPR's recovery requirements? And we will be sharing those results with you, so go ahead and make your selection and hit submit. And then for those of you who joined just recently, a reminder that you can get a PDF version of the slide deck right from the platform. Simply go to the Event Resources tab over on the left there and to download those the slide deck.
Thank you very much, Janine.
Yeah, thanks. And I was going to say, Alan, while we're waiting for people to make their choice here, I'm predicting, and this is always dangerous, that people are either answering the first choice or the last one. Certainly when I talk to people, they either have a good idea of GDPR or they've never heard of it. People don't seem to sit in the middle.
Yeah, I mean, I must admit, Phil, it's having spoken to a whole gamut of different customers, both from the US and Europe, you definitely see a varying level of knowledge. And I think, you know, as I said at the beginning, I think I've seen an increasing level of knowledge across organizations as the year's gone on. You know, and picking it up, we were surprised by how many of our US customers actually understood it. And how some of our European customers were perhaps not as aware as maybe we'd thought.
Okay, guys. I did send the results, so let's see how close you were on calling that one, Phil.
Yeah, it's always dangerous, isn't it? I don't buy lottery tickets very often. You'll probably tell why in a second. Okay. Totally opposite of what I said, by the looks of it.
Excellent.
Well, that's okay. We've got some semi-educated people, so we can plow on. But that's a surprise. I actually don't mind learning things. I'm surprised at that. It's going to keep me awake tonight, wondering why we got that answer. But what we need to think about is, and this is a conversation that comes up a lot when we talk to our customers about recovery. And as Alan said, the GDPR legislation is written very carefully in that it doesn't specify what kind of event you have to recover from, and neither does it actually specify an absolute time by which you must be recovered. So people are going to need a plan to cover whatever eventuality befalls them. And I think you paraphrase it, Alan, the time for recovery is going to be as fast as possible because people are not going to be given days to recover the data in this sense. So when we start talking about recovering from an unknown event, people tend to lean towards a disaster recovery type of strategy. And most companies now have got their disaster recovery plan nailed down. They use hardware mirroring. So every piece of data that they have at their primary site is mirrored somewhere else. If anything does befall that prime site, they just switch to the mirror. It's almost an instantaneous recovery, almost to the current point in time. Everybody can pat themselves on the back and business carries on as usual. The problem is, what happens if it's one of these not fatal events that takes down your entire data center? What if it's some data corruption or an accidental deletion of some data that shouldn't have been deleted? The problem, of course, then with a mirror is your mirror faithfully replicates the corruption that you've had at your primary site. And if the mirror is the only backup you have, your data suddenly is completely unrecoverable. And this did happen to a bank in the UK a few years ago, not a database-related incident, but it was severe enough that the bank was effectively down to all of its customers for a period of a few days. it took them almost a week to get life back together, because if the bank doesn't trust its data, they can't allow their customers access to their money because they don't actually know, does this customer have any money or not. So unfortunately, you can't rely on a disaster recovery plan as being the absolute solution to everything, which is why we come along with an alternate thought of software-based backup and recovery, and that's really what I'm going to talk about for the next 30 minutes or so. Because we've done benchmarks against most of our competition, customers have done benchmarks against the competition, and we feel fairly comfortable in saying that we have the fastest database recovery tools for the mainframe, both for Db2 and for IMS. So that definitely ticks the box for recovery in a timely manner, I think is the phraseology from GDPR. The other thing, as Alan mentioned, people are going to need to be able to prove that their data is not just recoverable, but recoverable in that particular period of time. So we have a number of things, I'll talk a little bit later about simulation and estimation, which allows you to find out with very little effort whether your mainframe database data is recoverable or not, and is it going to be recoverable in the appropriate timeliness manner. And it also allows you to validate. As a software vendor, we tend to get involved in customers' recovery events because, let's face it, I hope none of you ever have to do a real production data recovery. But looking at the number of people that are in this audience, it's going to happen to somebody in the not too distant future. And it's probably the first time it's happened to you, and it may well never happen again. So you tend not to have the expertise to do a real live, oh my God, my business is in danger type of recovery. Whereas ISVs, we tend to get involved maybe once a quarter, maybe even more often than that. So we've had too many cases where people have got partway through a recovery and discover that one of their Db2 tables or one of their IMS databases is not recoverable for some reason. Either the database wasn't backed up the way somebody thought it was going to be, or log data sets are missing, or they've been purged due to a GDG cycle that wasn't created big enough. You know, if you're going to have something that's unrecoverable, you want to find out about that before it becomes critical, not at the point it becomes critical. So we'll talk about the simulation. That also allows you to validate that your recovery plan is going to work. All of your data is going to be recovered in that timely manner. We'll talk about data integrity. Anything that's involved with pointers, unfortunately, is prone to bugs in the database, and data can go missing if those pointers get broken. So we'll talk a little bit about how we manage integrity and how we can alert you to integrity issues. And repeatableness, again, as Alan said, GDPR doesn't want you to prove once that you can match their criteria. You are required to repeatedly prove this as often as your auditors require. And this is pretty neat, I think, part of the legislation, because they recognize that our IT world doesn't stay still. Both the technology and the platforms that we use are all the time changing. Applications are changing at a far greater rate than they ever were if you go back 10 or 20 years. And the amount of data we have is growing. In some cases, it's growing at an almost unmanageable rate. So the fact that GDPR requires you to go back once in a while and revalidate that you can pass all their tests is a really interesting part and a very good part of the legislation. So we reckon that with a decent tailwind, there's no reason why you couldn't put a good software backup and recovery strategy in place in less than 2 months. We've had customers who've done it in even less time than that. The problem comes if you've got multiple environments to cover, then obviously you start having to multiply those 6 weeks out. But it's not a job that's going to keep you awake for months on end trying to get it done. So I've already mentioned estimation and simulation. I need to just spend a little bit of time differentiating between the two. Estimation is some calculations that we do based on the type of backups you've done, the recovery you're trying to achieve, and the power of the machine that you're running it on and the version of Db2 or the version of IMS that you're running. So it is exactly what it says. It's an estimation. It's a thumb in the air or a finger in the air estimate of how long your recovery is going to take. So like any estimate of anything, you have to take it with a pinch of salt, but at the same time, it's extremely quick, very simple to set up, and really puts no more load on your system than you see currently. So it's not something that's going to run for hours and hours and hours. So it's a very quick way of saying, am I close to being non-compliant or am I totally non-compliant? So if your auditors come along and tell you that you have to do your recovery in 90 minutes or less, an estimation tells you that you can do it in 45 minutes, then you're probably okay. You probably don't need to worry. But if the estimation came back with something like an 80-minute estimate against your 90-minute target, now I'm starting to worry because I know an estimate's not going to be 100% accurate. I'm getting too close to being non-compliant. I need to dig a little bit deeper and see how I'm going to do. So this is why we offer recovery simulation, because what a simulation is going to do is everything that you will be required to do in an actual recovery. So if you like, it's recovering all of your production data. The only thing it's not doing is overwriting the real production databases with the data you're recovering. It's using effectively a shadow set of data sets to do that. The advantage to doing a simulation now is it really is a measure of how long the recovery is going to take. So you can set the recovery simulation running, start your stopwatch, watch as it runs through. When the simulation is complete, stop the stopwatch again. That is how long your recovery will take, no argument. The other nice thing about the simulation is you can then look at the output of the recovery simulation to see if there are any areas of improvement. Maybe there is a bottleneck you didn't realize you had, where perhaps two pieces of work are trying to recover objects that were backed up on the same tape, so one has to wait for the second one. Those kind of things are nice to be able to sit down and look at in the calm of day rather than in the middle of the night. And let's face it, if we're doing a recovery, it's almost always in the middle of the night. So simulation gives you that certainty that you can meet your RTO, those recovery time objectives. It allows you to deliver proof to your auditors or to any external auditors you might have that this is our recovery, this is how we can do it. And once you've defined one of these recovery simulation job streams, you can run it as and when you want. So it becomes a very easily repeatable process so that when maybe the data has grown a little bit, I can rerun the simulation. Yes, I'm still compliant. I still get the big green tick, and I'm still happy. One thing I should have mentioned when I was talking about estimation is you can tweak some of the attributes of what you're estimating. So if you know your data is going to grow by, let's say, 10% over the next 12 months, you could do a recovery estimation based on a 10% increase in your data volume. So now we're kind of predicting the future. What does my recovery RTO look like if my data increases by 10 or 15%? And that gives me advance warning that I've got a problem, not today, but I may have a problem in 12 months' time that is going to have to be resolved. So it's always nice to be pre-warned of those things. So as I said, everything we've talked about thus far applies to both IMS and to Db2. What we also have is coordinated recovery. If you have applications that span both database management systems, then with BMC, it's relatively easy to recover both of those databases back to a common point of consistency. So both a Db2 database and an IMS database can be brought back to a point of commonality. Again, with everything else we've said about recovery times and speed of recovery, all that applies as well. So that brings me into another comment. It really, as an ISV, we spend a lot of time making sure our tools run as efficiently as they can. And I was doing a presentation in Europe earlier on this year to a group of executives from some of our larger customers. And one of them mentioned, yeah, it's all very well and good to talk about recovery efficiency, but really that doesn't matter. If I'm doing a real production recover, the only thing that matters is speed. How fast can you get me back? How fast can I be back online? How fast can my customers be back accessing my system again? And that's the other thing that's nice about estimation. You get an idea of how long your recovery is going to take. So I remember I had to do a production recovery years ago when I was a DBA, and I had no idea how long it was going to take. I'd never done it before. I'd never been able to simulate it. I'd never practiced it. It came out of the blue. And all I can remember of that day is my manager standing behind me asking me every couple of hours, Isn't it finished yet? How long is it going to be? And the only answer I had was, I don't know. And that's not a good answer. So you need something that performs at speed that you can accept, the fastest possible. We already said that. We have a choice of options for both backing data up and doing the recovery. You know, I said before with mirroring and software to some extent is the same. If you only have one option, you may well get hit by some sort of recovery that you can't recover from. You need choices, you need options. And as I said again, because we feel we have the fastest recovery tools that's possible to buy for mainframe databases, we can help define what actually timely means. If somebody goes to your auditors and says, we think we need 12 hours to do this recovery, but with BMC you can demonstrate you could do that 12-hour recovery in 2 hours, then obviously 12 hours is not timely. It's likely to not be acceptable. I thought long and hard about whether to put benchmark figures in this presentation because we all know the only benchmark that really makes sense is the benchmark that the customer runs themselves. But I couldn't resist this one because it shows you what I mean about the difference an ISV can bring to the speed table. This is comparing our version 11 software with Db2 11 because I think that's what the majority of the world is currently running. And yes, that big blue bar on the left really does shrink to the orange bar next to it. That's what a difference we can make to the elapsed time. So what's that? From just under an hour in this case for one table to just over maybe about 8 minutes. The CPU time is vaguely similar across between ourselves and IBM, but like we just said, that tends to be much less of an issue. What is an issue is how long it takes me to recover that data. I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions from that. And again, from the IMS side, a couple of points of note. A couple of customers we had, I don't have any details, they wouldn't let us share the details, but one of them is saying, you took my recovery time down from 24 hours to 5 hours, or in one case, down from 30 hours to 2 hours. So again, significant improvements can be had running recoveries from an ISV like BMC software. I want to touch on graphical UI just for a second because a lot of people listening to this call are probably DBA systems programmers happy with a 3270 ISPF interface. But what we're also seeing is younger people coming now to support these databases, and they tend to prefer to work in a graphical environment. And it also allows us to bring some much needed, easier visualization than we were ever able to do on the 24-line by 80 character 3270 screen. So this is just a very quick, fuzzy example of a simulation that we can run within our Workbench product. This is a recovery simulation. What you're looking for is the big green tick. So it can easily take this. Now, you haven't got to take an ISPF printout or a job log to your auditors and explain to them what all this gobbledygook means. You can show them on a nice graphical UI. This is what we set up. This was our test case. These are the number of objects we were recovering. This is what we set for our recovery time objective. And BMC shows us we can achieve that with time to spare. We get the stamp of approval. And again, if you're doing the estimation, you can also do growth projections. Like I said before, if the data is growing, can we still hit the recovery time the same way, or do we need to rethink our plans? So we talked about proven timely recovery. Yes, you can define and validate that your critical data is going to be recoverable, not just in the time available, is recoverable completely. This is particularly one customer example. They actually did some work. This is outside of GDPR, in fact, but very similar. They have some legislation that says they are a banking industry customer. They have to be back online within a certain period of time after, again, any unspecified failure. In their case, they were recovering 43 terabytes of data in under 4 hours. That was their recovery time objective. And they actually ran their simulation at probably the worst time in the week for them. It was the furthest point away from when they'd last taken their image copies. So as well as 43 terabytes of data to recover, they were applying 22 billion log records on top of that 43 terabytes of data. So it almost became a worst-case scenario. If I just move on to the next slide, it's a little bit of a lot of words on there. I'm not going to read it all, but they realized that there really only was one solution in the marketplace to help them demonstrate that they could recover that amount of data with that number of log records, changing the data in the time they had available. And in fact, to paraphrase, or not paraphrase, to quote the customer directly, they said that it was clear there was only one product set that meets their requirements, and that was the product set from BMC software. There's nothing else on the market that would either allow them to do that kind of recovery in that amount of time, or even be able to prove that they could do that amount of recovery in that amount of time without actually doing the recovery. And I'm sure you're all aware that to take a production system offline for any significant period of time just so that you can test your recovery, that's not going to fly. You're never going to get that past your management as a sensible strategy. And that brings me back to a point I made earlier on, and this is the second part of the audience participation for today. So I'm interested to know, and I'm going to make no predictions this time. I've been burnt once. I'm not going to make that mistake again. If we open up the poll, Janine, we're interested about when people did their last recovery.
Great, Phil. Okay, folks, you should see the poll on your screen now. So if you would go ahead and make your selection and hit submit, again, we'll share those results with you.
And I bet Alan's not going to be brave or stupid enough to make a prediction either. I wish I hadn't done that now.
I think most people will have done something in the last 12 months.
Which covers 3 out of the 4 categories. Thank you. Very smart answer. And I hope you've all noticed that we brought a European flavor to this European GDPR webcast by having both the presenters speaking from the UK. So.
Well, we're getting a consensus. It's actually interesting. I'm going to give it a few more seconds to see if one of these is going. Yeah, see if one of these can take the lead or.
It's looking like it's sitting on the fence pole right now.
It is. It is.
I'm glad to see people are actually participating. I always wonder when we're doing these type of webcasts how engaged the audience are. So it's a very good idea for us to drop these polls in. So I'm glad we can do this.
Okay. I feel like we should get one more update here pretty soon, but interesting, guys. I think we'll go ahead and send these results out.
Yeah, okay. Not a problem. I can work with that. So it's not an even spread, but a fairly decent spread across the whole range, ranging from a quarter of you have done a recovery in the last 3 months, a quarter of you haven't done a recovery in the last 12 months. So, yeah, Alan, you win the prize because that 25, 56, 80, so 75% have done a recovery in the last 12 months. Yahoo. But that just sort of stresses something I mentioned earlier on, that some of you are doing recoveries regularly. In a sense, that's a good thing because you're practicing what you need to do. I'm wondering, though, whether it's also a bad thing if you're doing recoveries that regularly, what is going on in your environment, or maybe it's people are doing test recoveries. Maybe that's an alternative. Or the people that haven't done a recovery in the last 12 months, that's great because everything is ticking along perfectly happily. But if you do have to do recovery, then you don't have the practice and the experience to jump in with both feet. So it's a double-edged sword. Whichever end of that poll you're at, I can pick fault with it and cause some concern. But beyond recovery, we do a mainframe survey at BMC every year, and some of the results of the 2017 mainframe survey are on the screen right now, and it shows that people do have concerns about recovery. The top thing in the priorities for most people every year has always been cost reduction or cost optimization. But behind that, we've got things like data privacy, compliance, security, 44%, application availability 42. Those are all things that speak very squarely to a recovery concern or an availability concern. Data recovery is down there at 36%. That may be because people don't have to do recoveries on a mainframe very often. Sometimes when we do these mainframe surveys, we get low results in some questions, which we would expect to get people's higher attention, but it's because the mainframe environment looks after everything so solidly that those things don't become a concern because we don't have to worry about recovery. We don't necessarily have to worry about availability. But beyond recovery, Alan talked about data integrity, and GDPR, repeated it on the screen here, worries about ensuring confidentiality, integrity, availability, and resilience. So let's just touch on the integrity part for a second. Db2 is really, really good at protecting data. I've not come across very many, if any, occasions where Db2 loses or damages data the way IMS used to for me when I was an IMS DBA. But we've now got a lot of unstructured data being stored in Db2 large objects, which are managed in a very similar way to IMS data in the sense that it's a set of pointers linking the unstructured data back to the relational structured data that we all know and love. In a lot of cases, those large objects concern business critical data, but it may not be business critical data that you need every day. So a lot of this is being kept for compliance and legal reasons. And one example I always use is the telephone conversation with your bank. So when you call up your bank, there's a recorded message that says, this call is being recorded for quality and training assurance purposes. That, of course, is only half the truth. The real truth is we're storing this recording away so that if you come back to us in 6 months' time and argue that you were given some bad advice, we can bring the recording out of hibernation and go back over what the conversation was and be able to prove or disprove whether we gave you bad advice or not. So that data tends to be stored, written away, and never referenced again until it becomes critical. If at the point it becomes critical, it's unavailable or it's corrupted, that's very bad news. So people are starting to take the integrity of their large object data very, very seriously, because if it's been sitting around for 4 years and now I need it and it's corrupted, if I go back to my image copies, they're likely to be image copies of corrupted data. It may well have been corrupted 12 months after it was created, and the image copies I took at that point have long gone. They've long been rolled off the archive cycle for my image copies. So we have an unrecoverable data situation. What we should be doing with large object data is regularly checking its integrity. And IBM provides you a set of utilities to do a check lob, a check index, and a check data to make sure that the pointers and all the linkages between the large object data and the relational data are all intact and pointing to the right places. The problem is these take a lot of time to run. And because we've all grown up in an environment where Db2 doesn't break, they tend to get thrown overboard. People don't have the time anymore to run things like a check index or a check data utility. And you hear things like Db2 doesn't break, nobody has complained. That's my particular favorite, actually, because it's like going into a restaurant, having a really, really bad meal, and when the waiter comes over to ask how your meal is, you tell him it's really, really bad, and he looks at you and says, nobody else has complained. So suddenly it's the customer's fault, not the restaurant's fault. The fact that nobody's complained doesn't mean there isn't a problem. But often we do hear that we don't have time to run more processes. We don't have enough time to run the processes we do have, let alone any of these new ones. But this was an interesting quote I got from a customer at an event in Germany last year. We were talking about lob data. Fragility is probably not a fair word to use. It's not that fragile. But she said to me, yeah, we lost some large object data once, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was we never found out how it went missing, and we never found out a way of getting it back again. And those two things, the not being able to get it back is worrying enough, but to lose data and not really understand how you lost it, that just sends shivers up my spine. you can't afford that to happen with any data, and you certainly can't afford for it to happen under something like GDPR with the potential fines. And okay, maybe you wouldn't get hit by the ultimate sanction, but still, you don't want to be in a position where you can lose data and not understand where it went and how you lost it. So if we just loop back to the Mainframe survey results that I touched on a few slides back, just picking out those 4 things are all key to recovery and compliance. And you can see they are of concern. Time taken to recover is probably quite rightly the biggest concern people have. They've seen things befall other customers, and none of us want to be the next headline in the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal. Unless it's a good headline, we don't want to be mentioned there at all. And all of these things that people have as concern are all required to comply with the General Data Protection Regulation. The time taken to recover, the prediction, the proof of recoverability, and understanding that we are recoverable. They're all part of this recovery part of GDPR. So summary, I'll come back to the slide that Alan had, or largely similar slide to what Alan had. So GDPR mandates that you are recoverable, you're recoverable in a certain time, your recovery is accurate, so everything is going to recover the way it should do, things aren't going to get missed. We need to be able to provide tools to prove and continue to give us data integrity and proof that we have data integrity. And we looked at proof of recovery. We want to be able to prove that we can not only recover, but recover in the time we're given. And a repeatable process. GDPR requires us to be able to repeat that recovery time and time again, or repeat the simulation time and time again, so that we can prove we are still compliant even if time passes, the world changes, and our applications and our customers change. And IBM or BMC puts a tick in all the boxes. We've got that recoverability, we've got the speed, we've got the accuracy, we can give you a repeatable process, we give you the proof, and we give you the management of the integrity of the database. So that really wraps up all I was going to talk about today. So if we can just step back and take a breath, Janine, I think we're ready to go to Q&A.
Excellent. Okay, let's get started. First question. I thought GDPR only applied in the European Union. Do you want to comment on that, guys?
Yeah, I'll take that one, Janine. So, no, it doesn't. Although it is a European Union piece of legislation, it applies specifically to the data of European citizens wherever that data is processed. I think I said before, I used the term extraterritorial. So if that data is stored in the US, if that's in Australia, if that's somewhere in Asia, then GDPR equally applies in all of those jurisdictions.
And I generally use myself as an example because I'm one of these people that's lucky enough to travel a lot for my business. Our headquarters at BMC is in Houston, so I'm a regular visitor to Houston, as is Alan. As soon as we buy our flight, well, Alan flies Virgin, so they're covered by GDPR anyway. But if I buy my flight from either United Airlines or Singapore Airlines, they have some personal data about me, whether they're in the European Union or not. That means that they need to comply with GDPR. As soon as I pick my rental car up from Avis and drive to my Marriott hotel, suddenly they have personal information on a European citizen as well. So it sucks the whole world into this GDPR realm because we're all global people now. We're not just sitting in our own country.
Okay, next question. I thought GDPR was mostly about protecting against data leaks and breaches. Is recovery really a focus?
Yes, it is about data breaches and things like that, but it's also about recovery. We've taken you through that part of it because that's the one piece that BMC feel very strongly that we can help with. But what tends to make the headlines is data leaks, and there have been some very nasty data leaks of late in the press. But that's not the be-all and the end-all of GDPR, as Alan mentioned when he went through his beginning. And if you are an insomniac and you fancy reading through the whole gamut of the legislation, then fine. Wikipedia actually has a pretty good summary of GDPR, which is a lot easier to read.
Okay. For those of you wondering if the webinar will be available following today's webcast, yes. So please be on the lookout for our follow-up email. It will be coming out probably tomorrow with a link to a recording of today's webinar so you can share that with your colleagues. Okay, next question. When would I consider running one of your estimations or simulations? And then it says, do I need to worry about both?
Oh, that's a good question. And that's something I do get asked when I go and talk to customers. Really, you need to remember what the difference is between a simulation and estimation. An estimation, the advantage to an estimation is it's very quick, very simple. The disadvantage to an estimation is it's not 100% guaranteed to be accurate. It's an estimate. The positive on a simulation is it's going to give you the exact answer about recoverability and recovery time. The downside to a simulation is it's going to take as long to run the simulation as it's going to take to run the recovery. It's going to consume all the resources that you need, so it's fairly CPU intensive. So it's not something you want to do very often. So what I tend to say to people is you would run an estimation to get a comfortable feeling of whether or not you are complying with your requirements for recovery. You're going to need to run a simulation every so often to give that proof, because an auditor is not going to take an estimate as a proof that you are recoverable in that time. But once you've run that simulation to provide that proof, maybe then you just run an estimation every so often to make sure that your recovery time is staying within the bounds you expect. You would then only need to go back and do a simulation again if you're either asked to reprove it for an auditor, or if your simulation seems to be, your estimation seems to be indicating you're drifting towards non-compliance.
Gotcha.
So they both have their place, basically.
Definitely. Okay. Seeing no more questions, I want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar, and I especially want to thank Alan and Phil for sharing their expertise with us today. Again, watch for that follow-up email with the link to the recording of today's webinar. That concludes our webinar. Thanks again, and have a great day.